Yeah. Now, I'm going to switch my direction to Latin America, where in Venezuela this week there has been a mass of international solidarity arrivals. The arrivals hall at Caracas has been extremely busy because all kinds of people from all over the world who wish to see the Chavez experiment in Venezuela, an experiment that has brought the people a level of sovereignty and independence they never before enjoyed, and has distributed the wealth of Venezuela to places and people that never would have tasted it before. There's a lot of people want that to succeed. And in a way, the more Donald Trump and Elliot Abrams and John Bolton want to destroy it, the more people around the world want to save it. It's kind of obvious. Now, one of the British visitors, I don't know how many there were, but when I saw that she was one of them, there was nobody else I wanted to interview. Joti Brar is the vice president of the Communist Party in Britain. She's an outstanding person. I know her well, and all her family also well. She traveled with me all the way to Gaza from London in the great convoy that broke the siege on Gaza. A truly outstanding person, and I'm hoping she's on the line now. Joti, are you there?
I'm there, George. Can you hear me okay?
Fantastic. Better than I expected,
Right.
I must say. Lines to Venezuela have not yet been degraded. That's for sure. Tell us what you're doing there first, Joti.
Cross your fingers.
Yeah. Tell us what you're doing there.
Okay. So we came out at the invitation of the PSUV, which is the party that's in power at the moment in Venezuela. They are very strong in the trade unions, and they were very keen to organize a conference of trade unionists and supporters from all over the world in order to try and coordinate the support that they know is out there, but which can be sometimes quite disparate. So we have been involved in the first international conference of workers from around the world in solidarity with Venezuela to discuss what we can do and how we can coordinate our efforts globally.
And where are the people coming from in terms of parts of the world, countries?
So a huge representation, as you might imagine, from the Caribbean, from Central America, from South America. There were a few people from North America. There were some people from Europe, some people from Africa, pretty much the whole world represented.
Excellent. Now, have you met any of the leadership in Venezuela yet?
We have, yes. We were very lucky to have a rally with President Maduro was there. The first day we arrived, we came a little early and were able to take a visit to the housing ministry. And I actually sat in on the weekly meeting where the housing minister talks to the nation. So he has a meeting with his cabinet, and it's filmed and put onto state television, where they discuss what they've achieved that week, what they've built, what problems they're encountering, what they plan to do in the next week, etc. And they had, at that meeting, they talked about the 8,000 new homes they were delivering this week.
This week?
How it was
this week?
This week.
My goodness, we haven't built 8,000 homes in London in the last 10 years.
Well, not for ordinary people, we haven't, George, no. And
no,
these are homes for the poorest workers.
Yeah.
Homes for the poorest workers. In Venezuela, workers have the right to a home, and the poorest people are being constantly rehoused into better homes. And so one really interesting thing that happened at that meeting was that there were two separate delegations in the meeting. One was a delegation of athletes who had won medals at the Pan American Games recently. And they're ordinary working class kids who have performed for their country, and they, with their families, came to receive the keys to a car and a home from the government as a thank you for their work. And they were very appreciative of the government's commitment to them and their training despite the blockade and the support that they get. So that was one thing that was really interesting. The other thing that happened was they received a committee of self-builders. Now, I don't know if you know, George, but there have been 1.7 million homes, no, 2.7 million homes so far delivered under this program since 2011 of building houses for the workers. Mm-hmm. And a third of these, I think 37%, I was told, have been built by self-build teams. So workers in their communities get organised, and the government gives them materials and support, and they build them themselves. Yep. And these self-build teams are predominantly women. There are tower blocks, 6-story apartment blocks have been built solely by women in Venezuela. At the grassroots level, the revolution is very much run by women.
Hallelujah. This idea of self-build comes from Cuba, in fact. I've traveled with something called the Blas Roca Brigades, which go, for example, if there's a hurricane or damage, storm damage, all the volunteer labor of builders and joiners and glaziers and plumbers and so on, they descend on the damaged area and rebuild the house as quick as you could say Jack Robinson. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But I had no idea it was women that were forming the bulk of these brigades in Venezuela. That is very good news indeed. What about the blockade? What sort of impact are you seeing? What can you see with your eyes that you could say that's an impact of the blockade?
It's very interesting, George, because actually with your eyes you don't see very much at all. It's very clear that the spirit of the people is to carry on and to overcome the difficulties, not to complain about the difficulties. People are walking around, cafes are open, shops are open, people are getting on with their lives, the factories are busy making backpacks for the kids. They're going back to school in a couple of weeks, and every school child will get a backpack with books. They will get food, they will get uniforms, all provided so they can have a good education. And in fact, President Maduro told us at our meeting with him that they intend to make this year the best year yet for education in their country, despite the blockade. But of course, we know it is causing problems and hardships. It's hard for them to get hold of things they really need. Small things you notice, like, if you're in a building with 2 lifts, maybe one of them isn't working and they can't get the parts to repair it, so you queue a little while to use the lift. Or there's fewer light bulbs, I don't know if it's saving electricity or saving light bulbs or both, but small things are noticeable. But what's really noticeable is the spirit of the people.
Now, what about the pretender to the throne? I've forgotten his name already, but the fellow who appointed himself the president of Venezuela and was promptly given...
Juan Guaido.
Well, if you say so. Who was promptly given billions of dollars stolen from Venezuela, not least by our own Bank of England. Any sign of his supporters? Any sign of him?
None at all. Where I've been, and obviously, it's mostly been in the popular working class areas, he's a laughingstock. When people talk about the day of the supposed coup, they say, we were there, we were on the streets, nothing was happening. People were at the airport, nothing was happening. Sorry? Oh, yes. In one, we heard a story, an anecdote. Someone went to one of the opposition areas and was trying to call people out on the streets. It's time to rise up. It's time to rise up. And someone opened the window. Now, bear in mind, this is an area where the people are hostile to the government. Someone opened the window and said, "Go to bed. It's too early. Leave us alone." So this is the mass support that Guaido has. In fact, before he announced himself the president, half of Venezuela had never heard of him. He's not a mass figure. He never stood in an election for president, for example, which, people in Britain are not really aware of this.
No, in fact, Britain is still recognizing him, and the Bank of England's not undoing, how can it, the stealing of Venezuela's gold. Other European countries are backtracking and pretending it never happened. It's all a bit of an embarrassment now, Joti.
It's very embarrassing, because they miscalculated entirely. They hoped that with the blockade they could create the kind of unrest that would make people feel like they've had enough. They'll just get rid of their government. But in fact, what they've achieved is the opposite. The more pressure they put, the more that the people here realize that it's the external forces who want to kill their revolution and take away everything they've gained. And the people understand what it is they've gained. You know, the housing, the musical education, the jobs, the general lifting up, the community involvement of people. You know, we have seen working class people engaged in running their country. You know, all the people we've met from the Constituent Assembly, I've met several representatives while we've been here of the Constituent Assembly, they're workers. These are real working people representing other working people, and working people are trying to solve problems and move society forwards towards a socialist vision. And it's very, you can feel the spirit here of what they're trying to do, and they understand what they have to protect.
I wish we had some workers in the British Parliament.
That would be amazing, wouldn't it? It's a very different atmosphere.
Can you stay on the line? I've got a caller who might be able to talk to both of us. Fra in Belfast, who's been in Caracas recently. Fra, are you on the line?
Yes, George, how are you doing? Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to people.
Welcome. Joti's still on the line in Caracas, so you could talk to both of us.
Yes, brilliant, fantastic. Really, really, really pleased. I'd like to just second basically everything that Joti has said. I spent 10 days on a solidarity visit. I was with a group called Puebla, which is people to people, which were regional farmers, like a farmers collective in the Yaqui province in Karachi. They are growing food at cost price. The only thing being added to that is the distribution costs. And then we witnessed that being distributed in one of the barrios in San Agustin in Caracas. And we accessed the barrio through the cable cars that have been paid for by the Venezuelan people through their taxes and through the program of social reform by the Venezuelan government, which I believe spends up to 74% of its budget on its social programs. I also visited the apartment blocks and homes that are being built to rehouse people from the slums, and you know, the ones that I saw have like 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. They're state of the art. They're built in complexes that have clinics, education. You know, the poverty rates have fallen from like 43% to 20%. Extreme poverty is down from 20% to 5%. 1 in 3 Venezuelans are studying, 1 in 9 are in university. That makes that educational population the 5th largest in the world. What was expressed to me, that the real problem caused by the sanctions is the scarcity of food, and that was trying to be redressed by the farmers because of the inflationary pressures that this is putting on the economy. So the price of bread could be, I don't know, say like 200 bolivars in the morning, but it could be 300 in the afternoon. And
what about that, Joti, about the food? Were you conscious of a food scarcity there in the shops, in the stalls, the markets?
Personally, George, I haven't been conscious of that. But, you know, I'm not living the life of every ordinary person. I couldn't say for sure that nobody's having any problems. My understanding from talking to people is that they're having to change their habits according to what's available at any time. But what I'm also aware of is that food is extremely heavily subsidized, and anybody who's having problems getting food has food delivered to them by the government. They have a program to make sure people are eating, which is something a long way away from what workers in Britain have.
Fra, when you were there, as you know, I have a very long association with Cuba and with the former leader, Fidel Castro. I was very conscious, indeed greatly moved, by the Cuban medical teams in the poorest areas, in these barrios that never had a doctor before, never. There's no question of them having a doctor, and if they were sick, if they didn't have money, they would have gotten no attention in the past. Now, with the Cuban volunteer medical brigades in Venezuela, the poorest people's health has begun to uptick. Life expectancy going up, infant mortality going down, and so on. Are either of you able to tell me if these teams are still working or whether the blockade is somehow affecting them?
George, I was in Karachi, as I say, in the province of Yarkir.
George, is that as far as the blockade goes, it doesn't affect the relationship with Cuba, that they are able to carry on as before, expressing their solidarity in both directions.
Fra.
Yes, George, we actually met two Cuban doctors who were in Karachi in this province of Yarkir, just briefly in the street outside of the clinic. Someone pointed them out to us. But one of the major issues around the sanctions is medicine. There have been statistics of around 40,000 people with preventable deaths due to a lack of insulin, blood pressure tablets. Malaria and tuberculosis are both making a return because of the blockades. I didn't see any shortages in the shops. I actually went with a couple of guys who were on our delegation, and they bought basketballs for one of the local community groups because the kids like to play soccer and basketball and baseball, some of the American games. So I didn't see any real shortages, as I say, just the inflationary pressures,
yeah.
Typical, you know?
Okay, Fra, thanks very much for the call. Joti, stay on the line if you would, because Bruce in Australia wants to ask us a question. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, hi, George.
Hi.
Just ringing in relation to the Venezuela conflict and also Iran and many of the others, is that because of its oil and its past colonial dealings with countries there, it was proving a little beneficial to the country. And Venezuela itself took over the oil side of itself and paid off their World Bank loan, etc., and decided it was no longer going to use the American dollar to trade. And since then, of course, the sanctions have come on, which affects everybody, like young, old, everybody else. Similar again in relation to Iran, which January last year decided it was no longer going to use the American dollar for trading, and in June America put on sanctions there. In Libya, it's all involving the American dollar and protection of
Well,
such.
definitely the American dollar is under pressure, particularly from decisions by Russia and China to trade with each other in their own currencies and bypass the dollar. There's a decision, it's true, of Venezuela not to price in dollars. Ditto Iran. The role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency is definitely under pressure. Joti, what's your take on that?
Well, listen, George, we know that the imperialists talk about democracy, but what they want is total hegemony. And they will go all out to try to gain and preserve that hegemony. What's really interesting is that what we are seeing at the moment is an empire in decline, and quite swift decline, actually. And the ruling class in the USA is very much divided against itself. It's in a state of chaos. And when we look at its imperial adventures in the last 10 years, 5 years, what we're seeing is failure after failure. The regime change attempt in Syria has been a failure. The regime change attempt in Venezuela has been a failure. The regime change attempt in Iran has been a failure. The regime change attempt in Yemen has been a failure. Everywhere we look, these wars, they're costing the people dearly, and the people who resist are paying a heavy, heavy price. But the resistance is winning.
Final word to you, Bruce, in Australia. Tell us, what's the Australian government's take? Did they recognise this fellow in the street who said he was the president of Venezuela? Are you one of these, are you led by these kind of chumps like we are?
No, it doesn't really come up in conversation in the street. I watch a lot of YouTube and Duran reports and things like that. And it was interesting to note that, you know, as far as the trade war goes and everything else, there was an Indian fellow on the television, or I think he might have been a politician, and he said, well, the trouble with America, it doesn't treat other countries as inclusive. Though, if it's not a win, it's a war.
That's a good line.
And of course, there's a Dutch politician who treats Trump as the man with the carrot in front of the donkey when it comes to North Korea, and he'd probably use the same tactics against Iran. But anyhow, you're very strong in what you're doing there.
Thank you. A very, very interesting call, Bruce. Thank you very much. So, Joti, what happens now? How long is your delegation in country for?
So, in fact, George, I'm actually being called to my flight. I'm in the airport now, about to leave.
Well, you better go, because I wouldn't want you left in Venezuela. Your father would never forgive me.
I'd be happy to stay, but I think my family wouldn't be too happy. So okay. I had better go. But, George, thank you so much for having me on your show.
It's been
and I
marvellous.
hope to see you soon.
You're the first guest that's ever been called off the show because she might miss her flight. Thanks very much, Joti Brar, the Vice President of the Communist Party.